Okay, about to start another battle in Quatre battle in Espagne. Yeah, this one's going to be Salamanque, which is actually a pretty important battle. Wellington and Marmont are kind of facing off with fairly equal forces, marching, looking for an opening. And Wellington sees one where Marmont is spread out a little too much and jumps in. And historically, this was really part of the Wellington legend, the real beginning of it. Yes, he was in India and impressive there too, but this is the first major, I think, maybe the first European battle he's commanding. They don't go into everything in here. They go into the details of the battle itself. But I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of things. First of all, I'm in the midst of setup. And man, the setup for this one's obnoxious. So one thing you may have noticed is there's no hex numbers on this. Hey, okay, you can get by. It's a small map. God knows how they'll do that with the Waterloo combined, but whatever. Maybe that's 4 small maps. But the descriptions of where you put things. Okay, it starts off pretty easy. Division Foy at Calvarsa de Riba and the adjacent hexes. Fine. It took me a while to find it, but okay, if they're going to point things out like that, it would be nice if there was a little hex number there. Then it starts getting a little sillier. Clausel, halfway between the Greater Arapile and the South Map Edge. Well, the Greater Arapile is here. The South Map Edge is here. I first threw the stack here. I haven't deployed them yet, but I like to get a feel for what the battlefield's going to look like before I make my definite decisions on deployment. And, well, it gets worse, right? Then we go off into tangents. Ferre, 2 hexes around the most upstream bridge over the Arroyo de Ribiera. Well, I guess that's this one, because this is the river. That is indeed upstream, but given, my trust of the capability to explain things properly by the designer and his language familiarity, I'm always, kind of gritting my teeth. But it does seem to make sense. It looks like there's just a depth there. The 4 hexes of difficult terrain just south of here. But then here we get worse. Bernier, halfway between the Greater Arapile and Clausel division. So I had to slide this guy down and put this here. And I got to try to figure out what's up with that. And I'm not even sure that's right, because these guys are deployed also in the 4 hexes south of here, whatever that means, which I guess is these 4. Trying to see how much more. So much of it's related to not just terrain features, but other units on the map and relationship to them. And it's just weird. But then when we get to the artillery, the first 4 are spread 1 per 2 infantry divisions. What the hell's that supposed to mean? I've got these infantry divisions, and that's mainly how the deployments are. So I guess I get to give 1 here, but which 2 do I select here? Or could I select this one and this one and this one and this one and put 2 of my cannons up here? What is this supposed to mean? Okay. And then we get some specifics with a couple of remaining units. And then I have to go look up who Tomiares is, because if he has artillery, it has to be limbered. That's these guys. They're going to be marching down this road. I don't know yet what the Anglo-Allied reinforcements are going to be, but I don't know what that 1 per 2 is supposed to mean. I'm allowed to deploy them at will to half the, no more than 1 to any given one, but to half my divisions? Or is there some geographical constraint? Do I have to look at these 2 as 1 division? I don't know. I think I just give it to half the divisions, and I'm not sure. I'll probably come back and gripe about the Anglo deployment as well. or Anglo-Portuguese deployment. But there's something else. All the way at the back of this, there's a set of specific rules for these scenarios that I didn't see back when I did Ocaña. You know, I mean, I'm used to scenario books laid out in a certain way, and if there's specific rules, they're usually thrown right in the front, and I just didn't think. Now, there's nowhere in the sequence of play where it talks, or in the index table of contents where it talks about this. This is under 18 a few designers' notes, I guess. I'm not sure. It actually doesn't seem to be under anything. Maybe... See, there's special rules for the Battle of Saranian, but there's nothing to indicate I should even be looking back here. I ran into it when I went to go read the designer's notes for this particular batch and said, well, what the hell is that? So, you know, if you haven't played one yet, you may want to consider looking at these, looking at your rule book, your scenario book, and see just what it contains, because there's some surprises in here. So one of the surprises is the Anglo-Allied brigades. There's certain, and I don't know if this one's necessary or not, there's certain Anglo-Allied units that appear to be specific, brigades, even though it's a regimental-sized unit, of 3 to 5 battalions, but that have multiple counters because they historically would cover more ground. But because they wouldn't be separated up in a tactical deployment, what the game says is you have to either have them stacked or next to each other. Okay, that makes sense, but then that actually brought to mind some interesting questions. This is entirely missing, the divisional level of command. Basically, you have an army leader in general in the game, and in this scenario we're only going to have an army leader on each side. God knows what that's going to do. With a spread out battle like this, you can't command everything, which means units just aren't going to be able to operate, from what I can tell. We'll see if there's more special rules in here, but... and then some corps commanders, but what you don't have is a means to deliver orders to the divisions. Now, maybe I'm just being picky. Maybe I'm so used to the CWB NBS model where, hey, you know, and by the way, that's at a brigade level rather than a regimental level. But in that game, you have, you know, individual corps leaders are in that series, but then you also have divisional counters for command. When you get down to the regimental stuff, you have brigade leaders on the map that you have to channel orders through. And that gives you a reasonable level of tactical flexibility that, honestly, the brigade level games feel more detailed in terms of actually the command set situation in the NBS and CWB series than they do here, just because there aren't counters. I don't have these command divisions really in place in any sort of way. Now, of course, there's a lot of complexity added to that model because, and you can say, well, this game avoids some of that by waving its hand and saying it doesn't really matter, so that you can detach, you know, units from a division. You can detach divisions, well, maybe not divisions within a corps, but you can detach units within a division, and you have a lot of flexibility in your operations. So I can understand the point of not wanting that rigidity, because CWB and NBS end up having to come up with rules for detaching units and sending them off on special goals and such, and you don't have to worry about that here. But all the same, I still feel like I'm looking at this battle from a much higher elevation in terms of the level of detail of the organization, rather than what I see in a game that's supposedly, this is on a regimental scale, that's supposedly on a brigade scale. So, whatever. Some more. Voltigeurs. Okay, so this is probably the one that bugs me the most, because if this rule is used, every French line unit can deploy 1 Voltigeur, and every light regiment 3. Okay, well, gosh, line units in line formation, I was allowing to throw 2 out each because that's the core rule to the series. And then there's this reversal to it here, which seems to make the French less capable of throwing them out from their line units. And the Spaniards don't get to deploy any. Boy, that would have changed that battle if the Spanish had no skirmishers at all. I'll tell you why. Because the French would be able to march up in column formation, screen their march somewhat perhaps with their skirmishers, which the Spaniards wouldn't really be able to attack, and then launch attacks in column. And the whole battle would have been a different flavor had this rule been in play. The Spanish were the ones probably most likely to be throwing out 2 skirmishers per unit. Command and control. Victoria has fairly classical structure. Okay. This should be in the rules, right? I think it actually is. For the other battles, there's only 1 army leader. Army leaders have a command radius of 10 hexes, except for Arizaga. I think that's covered in here, but whatever. You know, I did have some question about, gee, what's up with those commanders with the army leader? Well, this doesn't really help explain it. It just points out the problem, which I could already do. There's no real rules to handle. Hey, what do you do when you have an army leader and no corps leaders? Well, the obvious example seems to be treat him like a corps leader. Boy, that's going to cause problems here in terms of command and control, but that's all I can see it as. Tells you the stuff that's in the basic rules, the core rules, about the initiative and obedience values and where they are. I don't think there's a difference. I'm not sure. I didn't go back to check, but why the hell write this in here? Notes on the counters. Okay, this is sort of designer's notes here. When we get here, grouping of units, they take some smaller units and sometimes shove them into one counter and combine them in a command. The decorative nature of, you know, these individual trees out here and such not. Okay, that's useful to have. I kind of figured that out. And that's about it. And then we have their bibliography, some of which I'm always iffy on how valuable these are. You know, my feeling is this is something that could go online as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't take up too much space. But, you know, unless there's something you really need to read as sort of the understanding of how to do this. Otherwise, it's, you know, it's like footnotes in a research paper. If you're reading it just for reading it, you don't really care about them. All right. I'll finish setup and I'll come back with the special rules for this scenario. As best as I can figure out, this is more or less the starting setup that's expected. French kind of deployed in double depth line. I'm not sure why I have these guys in line with, you know, kind of a breakwater against the front English units. Over here, I've deployed to be able to push forward and move up, solidify the line. I'm kind of planning on doing the same here. I don't know, again, I don't know why I'm in line. Column is probably just as good for moving that kind of distance, but, well, I made the choice and that's where I'm stuck. Left some channels open here for the artillery. The Brits threw full skirmishers up, so it doesn't really matter and actually probably works out to the French disadvantage. Over here, forces facing off across from Los Arapiles. Small column of French units. Whether or not they should be in column, again, the Brits get to move first, so there's a chance that this column might get hit and get in an ugly position. But most of the units that we're looking at are also in column. Plans to move forward here. These guys moving into this gap, these guys over to this side. These guys is a reserve for the back. Over here, nothing going on down here. Now, leadership, Marmont is over here, Wellington's over here. They each have a 10 hex radius. And, you can't do much outside of that 10 hex radius. You can move closer to your leader. We're going to have some pretty dense formations where the fighting is actually happening because there's no subordinate commands in this at all and no way to like operate your troops that way. There's a number of what ifs and some special rules for the scenario, most of which are not that special to tell you the truth. But no reinforcements, lines of communication. French is over here. The Spanish is, or the English is here and here, from what I can tell. Maybe I'm misreading it. Maybe it's that one over there. The most western trail on the north edge. No, it's over here. Okay. That makes more sense because the French are coming from over there. The what ifs. Oh, victory. It's based on demoralization or desperation, and it's considered to be an equal fight. And the troops really are equal. We've got the points here, 82 and 88 for the demoralization level, 115 and 124. The English are a little larger. The troops are about equivalent in force. The English are, of course, better at firing than the French are. So you'll see with the pure English, well, see, here's what's weird. The English have like their Portuguese mixed in who are worse at firing, but the pure English units have a 4-point fire range. I'll do my best to try to keep those brigades together. I can identify them. It's just, it may be difficult in the heat of the battle to keep them from breaking apart. So the what ifs. The what ifs are basically allowing the French an alternative setup to allow them not to be separated and spread out with these units out here. This is the situation that made Wellington attack, though, right? Was that the French were obviously having, you know, some units trailing and everything, and it looked like a good opportunity. There might not have been a battle otherwise, so I find that kind of hard to take into my mouth right now, but I guess if you want a more balanced battle, playing it without the impetus on attack or anything like that going to the English, and there's no rules to enforce that. There's no terrain victory point conditions. It's just, you know, slug it out and try to knock each other off. The weakest of the, or the final option here is to give the French a special movement turn where they're not allowed to fight. No attacks, no firing, nothing like that. But they are given a chance to move some of their units a little bit further on. I want to go with the historical. For obvious reasons, I like historical situations. I like to see what happens in them. I don't really care too much about game balance, but it's kind of neat to have some options to modify what's probably a difficult situation for the French. Command control, I've already talked about. The two army leaders are 10-pointers. 10-point command radius, and we're basically going to be using level 2 command for this because there's nothing beyond that makes any sense. Marmont's wound. Okay, a reason the battle turned bad for the French is that Marmont was wounded early in the battle. If Marmont can be the target of any fire at any time, then you roll a die, and he's wounded on a 6. Now, he starts out in range of possible fire, which means he's going to have wound chance right from the beginning. And then he either has to cower, which is probably best, or, you know, suffer a fair risk of getting wounded early in the battle or at any point in the battle. The battle itself is 17 turns. Fairly long, but nothing too exciting looking on the terrain here. It looks very much like the other one. We got some streams and you know, some slopes and some kind of difficult terrain, but nothing really weird. The really weird one, Victoria, is going to be no, I'm sorry, the fourth one. Victoria is actually on a fairly flat outcome, and they go into a lot of options for that one, but Soraren, yeah, let's pronounce it vaguely Germanish. So that one actually is going to be in the Pyrenees, or in the edge of the Pyrenees, and it has some fairly significant terrain in it. And the rules on the terrain chart are modified for that particular scenario. Wherever there's something special, it's like here, because they got these steeper slopes, etc. So I guess we're going to start Salamanque. And this is actually the battle I'm most interested, for whatever reason, in the Spanish quartet. We'll see how Victoria works, but I know it's bigger, and I usually like the bigger battles. But this is the one that, you know, I maybe have the most historical knowledge of, even though it's very, very slim, to tell you the truth. So no orders writing, nothing like that here. We're going to see how the system holds out with this, and the Brits will start advancing. I'm going to try to step away a little more than I did with Ocaña, and, you know, maybe get this whole thing on one video. I do want to point out, though, that 10 hex command range out of Los Arapiles gets me these guys and these guys. Everything's in command for the Brits, really. The French are going to have a little harder time because their forces are not... So the English are spread as kind of... They look like they're spread out, but they're the interior arc, which is attacking out. The French have big gaps, and they're covering the exterior, so they have a little bit larger range. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We barely reach these guys over here. 1, 2, 3. And we don't reach the town over there. I think we probably 1, 2, 3. It doesn't really matter whether we reach these guys, because we can push them towards the command center. And that's the thing, though, because I can, you know, kind of try to shift the army over. I'm just trying to protect the movement of this column that I've got there. Let's open things up, coming down hard in the center everywhere. You can see they've pretty much got their entire force hitting the front arc of the French. Of course, the French are going to get to throw up some units to protect, you know, so that they don't have these gaping holes that they have right now. And they may do some shifting. We'll see. Remember, there's opportunity fire when you withdraw, so I don't know how much I can do. This kind of rough terrain here is really impressive. It reduces the British firepower to the same as the French, and the British units are small, so they could get meleeed pretty easily. That's kind of an ugly situation for them right there. Some over-exuberant Spaniards came charging in at the French here and shot back. I accidentally brought some artillery with me, which then I decided, well, it shouldn't be up at the front line. If it had been, it's hard for me to tell what some of the units are, the differentiation between the infantry, artillery, and cav. My eyes don't see it very easily. It's obvious here that this is artillery, but when it's like this, it's not quite so certain. And I had it at the bottom of a stack. You know, if I had just set up and started playing, I probably would have remembered. But I just moved the stack forward and didn't realize, hey, I would either have to unlimber my artillery, in which case it would, you know, at range 1, you don't really want to do that because the infantry can blow the artillery away. We saw an example of that here, where the infantry that was underneath the artillery got driven away. The artillery took a hit. Both failed their morale check, which is unlikely. And then these Portuguese managed, you know, had an easy assault against unmanned guns. Took it out. First loss of the game. First real loss of the game. We've got some disorder here, of course. And there's casualties around. Attacks where I had numerical superiority didn't necessarily work in terms of melee attacks. But this is our initial situation. We'll see how the French react to it. Marmont did not get killed by the initial auto fire. He's got to face it every time he comes under fire, but he's not terribly useful as a commander of the troops themselves. So we're going to have kind of a what-if situation here, because I think Marmont's going to pull out of the battle, run to the rear where he can keep command in line. It's more important to keep his big command in place. I don't know who replaces him. Maybe just a a replacement leader or something jumps in. And obviously that's not going to be as good. You replace him with Clausel, but he only has a 6 hex range. I think the 10 hex range, I'm not sure how good Clausel is, but there's just no way that I want my leader wounded. I want to be reduced to a 6 hex range. 10 hexes is enough to kind of command this battle. 6 hexes is not. We saw the difference, you know, between having lots of units in command and not having units in command was when we were playing the Ocaña scenario. Cav charge. You know, I'm trying to go into as much detail as I feel is needed and no more. But here, I think there is a need to discuss during cav charge. First, the French have some light cav here. Light cav's cool because it can turn twice. So conceivably, I could do a move out to here, make a turn, move to here. I can't turn two more hexes. So I was thinking about a flank attack here, but it would be tough to do. I'd have to get all the way out to here in order to hit with just 2 turns. But no matter what, the +6 movement during charge across a stream is preventing that. So I'm just going to have to redeploy that cav to threaten the flank. On the other hand, the British did leave a flank open here where there was some French cav in the back, and boom, they're getting through. There was no square success. The only way this thing's going to be in good shape after this is if the skirmishers can drive the cav off. Okay, and at the end of the first turn, the French are starting to, you know, form a position here. No fire was possible over on Marmont. He managed to get away. What do we have? We had a cav charge blasted through here. The second unit managed to form square. I'm really, really impressed with the quality of the English fire here. Now, that's absolutely on spot on. I haven't seen, I don't remember if Taliaferro, I think Taliaferro has English on it, but it doesn't really strike me as, I don't remember the English fire being quite this potent over in the NBS series, and I think this really captures it nicely. I haven't seen the English in many other things except for the old Wellington's Victory Day versus Wellington, where I don't have very good memories. There were some weird things about that I'll try to fix, but I'm really impressed with the quality here. It actually got me to thinking a little bit about the how much Empires in Arms versus EU, whether Empires in Arms really captures that quality enough. They give a high morale to the British units, but the Brits don't have the capacity. You have these chip pulls that like determine what your tactic in the battlefield is in Empires in Arms. In EU, you don't have that. You have this initial wave of firepower that is really, really, you know, it can break the enemy before they get a chance to bring their melee power to bear. Anyway, you can see there's a number of, and this is the cav that had to disorder after the attack, or else they would be left in a really dangerous position. Well, maybe not. Maybe they don't disorder. Maybe they take it. Right? This is, yeah, I can retreat. So the danger here is that this infantry can form as a line without causing a countercharge. So I think I want to get out of here. I don't want to suffer the full fire of an English unit without a chance to either countercharge or withdraw, neither of which I'd get to do if a square unforms. So I want to get out of there. You can see these guys streaming up, the guys from the town moving over. I've got these disorganized markers. I'm using them as additional skirmishers. They're meant to mark somehow the stuck in place, I think the optional artillery disorganization, but I'm not sure you really need them, except they kind of tell you, hey, this is artillery that's disorganized. So it's pretty much an empty hex. That could be helpful, but I don't have enough French skirmishers for even this battle. I'm just wondering what Vittoria is going to look like. I may dig through other games and end up having to maybe combine games of this series into one set of skirmishers, etc. If the Waterloo campaign ones have the same counters. You know, I'm not going to sell these. I'm pretty impressed with this system so far. I think we'll give Labatt a try, but I think this may end up being my go-to system for Napoleonics. I'm just kind of marveling over how these long counters kind of really express the linear nature in a mini sort of way, even with them just occupying a single hex. You know, the same facing, the same situations could all be expressed with normal square counters, but there's something appealing about this, where you can see, you know, the line following what looks like, you know, and then it's obvious there's a bulge here that's kind of a weak spot, much more obvious than when you just have this regular square counters that we're used to in so many games. And the Brits are making some definite headway against the French. Attack here has gotten us into this rough terrain that's going to be harder to dislodge us from. This is kind of rough stuff to fight our way through. The defenders get a bonus both in melee and in fire combat. By the way, I forgot to mention this. Cav charge up here turned this into a square. Artillery bombardments on it. Hey, welcome to 3 solid arms. You know, this isn't American Civil War anymore. The Cav is serving a real purpose here in a way that it couldn't in the ACW. Rifles were too powerful by then. What else? Another, well, here's something kind of interesting. The Brits, or actually, I think those are Portuguese, were driven back here after an assault on this hex. They had some pretty decent odds, but got a crappy roll, really. About as bad as could happen. However, over here, somewhere over here, they took out an artillery. They drove the infantry that was covering it out of the way. The artillery didn't break, unfortunately, for the French, and it was available. And now we got a couple more French units cashiered, as it were, and we'll do the French side of the turn. Something this game seems to apply that I don't know if very many tactical games give me that feeling for, is a real desire to have a tactical reserve. So these units back here that the Brits have, well, this gap becomes much less of a big deal because of it. I guess other games have this to some extent. At least the Terrible Swift Sword, the Great Battles of American Civil War kind of have it. I don't remember the Gamers games having this as much, though, because they have a certain fluidity to their zones where it's not that big a deal, at least in feeling, to sort of shift a line or extend a line a little further. Here, I've got a tough time, so if the French put pressure on here and buckle it in a little further, well, I got units behind the line so that I can kind of shift it back a little bit without any harm coming from it. It's just, that wouldn't be possible if these units weren't back there. I'd have to take additional fire to try to dress the line properly. And because it's got kind of the minis-like movement that I'm sure the Labatt series does too, that's a little less flexible than I'm used to in a lot of games, it means that you really get a good picture of needing to have those tactical reserves. Far too many times, games seem to let you get away without them. Realizing one thing that I've forgotten, which is artillery opportunity fire reaches out 2 hexes, which means if this unit in square here leaves, I get an op fire shot at it. I don't get a shot at it in square. As far as I can see also is that opportunity fire happens at the moment you leave the hex, which means, which would be pretty normal. If I want to turn around and leave, I'm getting shot in the ass. and that's not going to be very good, or, you know, in column in the S or whatever, which makes it very difficult to disengage in this game. Maybe too difficult for Napoleonic era, I'm not sure. It feels more like that earlier 7 Years' War, the Age of Reason era, in terms of how rigidly you're being fixed in place here. Really a tough decision because I've got this huge gap here, and that can't be good, right? I have an extra division here that should be able to fill the space in here. Maybe I got a couple extra units, but I don't feel like I can quite stretch the space that I need to. And especially I've got a gap farming here. What am I gonna do to fill this all in? And you know, this is a demoralized unit. The French are really, really tough, in tough straits here. Conceivably, I could march this flank force off, but then I've got this danger because then the English will have a superiority on that side. And if I shift Wellington over a little bit, I might be able to take advantage of that. But on the other hand, I really do need, I think I've got to try to get out of here, and that's going to be ugly. So I came out of square. I'll go into that for 1, 2, 3, and now I'm going to try to get out of there. And I got 10 artillery shooting at me. That's not good. 3, that's 1 hit on the 55, if I can read that correctly. And now it's at -3 to its morale, and it goes. And you can see that line's going to have a lot of trouble getting out of there. I got some protection because of you know, the terrain here, but I'm going to have a hard time getting out. And it was every bit as ugly as I suspected, and now I'm completely regretting this. More French units destroyed over there. You can see there's just a couple. I'd have been better off just leaving it there as a breakwater and let it get wiped out that way. It would have cost the Brits more. I hate losing units though, so trying to get them out to keep them from being encircled seemed like a good idea, but man, not under these conditions. I can throw a skirmisher out in front of one of these. I don't know where. Just to give me a little bit of protection there. But yeah, I mean, that command's basically wiped out and will be. And it would anyway. It's just now it's at almost no cost for the Brits. Over here you can see clouds of forces withdrawing. I'm trying to get a solid line going across one way or another. I still got a couple of little gaps. Not a lot of skirmisher action going on there because I had to knock skirmishers out of some of those hexes. I left a channel open here for artillery fire. But yeah, the numbers now, 28 losses for the French. Now, I have to get to 82, so I'm not going to worry too much about the disorganized units, but 6, 7, 8, 9 more. So, you know, I'm getting close to 40 there, about the halfway mark, whereas the Brits are basically fine. They have very high morale here. You can see some of these units with 10s, 9s. The British Army is really kick-ass. English right flank advances and is able to turn some of those disorders into routes. Of course, those would be gone for good if we were playing with the basic game, but I like watching them. Cav here filling a little gap. Could have been important. There's nothing organized there anymore, though. A little bit of gap covered by skirmishers as well here. But I got reserves in the background. We got one place where the British got flung back by some French artillery. And they didn't make any ground here. But they did break things up a little bit. Somewhere up here they knocked some more units. You can see the routes are increasing. The French will have a chance to rally, but they're not as good as it is the English. The English have a better morale, and you know, the difference between an 8 morale and a 9 or 10 the English units are mainly 9s, the French units are mainly 8s, is actually pretty significant because it's the difference between, 50% success rate at rallying and less than 50% by a decent amount. No, more than 50%. I'm sorry. 7s are a 50% chance. So, yeah, the difference between a 6 and a 5 is a difference of 50% because you're rolling 2 dice and a 7 comes up half, no, 1/6 of the time, right? Jeez, I'm trying to remember. Yeah. It only comes up a 6th of the time. But we're talking about a difference of 1/6 in terms of the chance of rallying, which is a pretty big jump for a morale factor. As the morale goes down, the differences change a little bit more. So like an 8 versus a 7 is a smaller difference than the difference between a 9 versus an 8. The 10, of course, has a little bit more padding. Counterattack somewhat successful with a melee attack up here using one of the units going up the hill to get us up to a 2-1. Otherwise, it was a 3-2 with just this unit. Drove away one of the good British units with sort of an automatic disorder, which is kind of cool. It's the way to get around those high quality units. But, when turn 5 comes around, whatever, that unit's going to recover fairly easily. We got the routing French. Remember, if you do from Ocaña, I end up deciding the routing units should just keep routing every turn. So they're kind of running back their way. Otherwise, you kind of have a situation where that doesn't feel like they're routing at all, and they're not going to disrupt the lines that much. They just become target practice, which is kind of not what they should be doing. So I like this. Disordered unit, though, can't move very quickly. It's not like the routing unit. It's not running at full speed. It's got an allowance to move a couple hexes, but that's it. We got something of a line built up here, cav protecting here. We didn't use the cav over on this side. This was a tough call. It was trying to withdraw this artillery piece was a hard job. Too hard for me to actually do, so I left these guys standing on that hill. If I get lucky, I've got the cav right now. I've got a unit to fill in the gap here, and I was hoping I would rally some of these units, but there weren't many to check for. A couple of these guys failed and kept running. No attempt by the Brits on their turn to try to get in this area. They want to play to their strength, and the French don't have enough power to try to push this way. In fact, Marmont, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, really can't take command of this artillery back here and still keep the rest of his line in order and make, the one unit that he had rally was the unit he went and stepped on top of. The only real question is whether I wanted to fill the gap here or worry more here. I had one unit that was free. And, if I fill the gap here, I can put the cav over here, but then my very center of my line is a weak spot, and that's something I didn't want to see. Had I known how much I would drive back the Brits this turn, well, maybe I wouldn't have sent my unit that way, because this is becoming kind of the strong point of my line anyway. Here at 1:30, you can see the English have pushed their line forward. Just makes me a little easier on the mind if I don't have the disorganized markers up at the front. I like the skirmisher, the actual skirmishers. They've pushed their line further, begun the enfilade over here from their right flank. They're keeping their left flank refused. No point in trying to pursue overall. And then over here, you can see the routed units got driven away by a couple of units here. But mainly we're doing the flanking maneuver here. Not trying to assault up the hill. That's too hard. Firing up a hill is fine. Although we'll see and this kind of confused me on the battle that's going to be in the Pyrenees. We're going to see much more significant effects of the slopes. But in general, the slopes are considered to be gentle slopes that, you know, it's a little harder to charge up them. You lose some momentum, but firing up them is perfectly reasonable. But anyway, a little bit of engagement here just to try to rout this unit or get it out from behind my lines one way or another. You know, keeping an eye on things. These big 10 hex radius means that I don't have to commit a leader over to command that or anything like that. Not that I have one. And I've got everything within the sphere. One thing that I'm looking at with this situation, and I'm kind of debating how I want to handle this, is I think the French are destined to break. You know, I mean, this scenario, the division of the forces, and this system, that division of the forces is really, really a desperate situation. I didn't realize just how bad it was. But, you know, the ability to be able to give flanking fire in certain situations, the ability to isolate a few units and start disordering them, and then they have nowhere really to run except all the way back here. It really causes some significant issues in the game. So, looking at the French situation and how badly they've been mauled so far, I'm beginning to think that, well, maybe you'd reassess your victory conditions at this point, right? You know, agree that you've already lost the battle as stated, but now the question is how much of your army can you withdraw in good order? In which case, you know, maybe that decision isn't completely made yet. Maybe I'll still try to make a stand here in this rough terrain. But to some extent, there's the, if I can get units off the map in good order, I might be able to reduce the level of victory that the Allies are going to get. Because if the French just stand around and they get to the disordered level and the English are still fairly low in terms of the amount of damage they've taken, I have the feeling that, you know, there's no chance of evening things up by pushing the battle to where both sides are disordered. All I'm going to get out of that is the total desperation morale situation. So, given that, you know, once you make that assessment that that's what's likely to happen, it feels like the desirable decision from the commander's point of view is to try to withdraw. Now, we've seen withdrawing is damn hard in here, so I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't put any money on that because once units start to break, the whole line is just so fragile and rigid. Again, almost feels too much so for a Napoleonic game. Just look at the effect that this light cav here has had. It's just kept the Brits from advancing there. Now, it's not a complete panacea, but the point is there are reasonable forces to take advantage of a successful charge. So, because I don't have an overwhelming amount of force, and more is coming in, so it may be the day that I do, that's sufficient to hold the British line back in that area. It's just such a scary thing, the idea of being charged. The light cav, especially with its 2 hex range, it's just a very, very frightening possibility. And those counter charges, there's not a whole hell of a lot you could do about them. You can't form square because you're marching forward and they just unleash on you. So I think the charge zone that's projected by just placing something like that is just as effective as, you know, the kind of charge zones you see over on Wellington's Victory. And in other games, well, in the NBS series, the Cav also have a nice little radius for it. However, it only really applies to the light Cav. The regular Cav only has a 1 hex range, which means it isn't, and the light Cav only in the optional rules, which means it really doesn't project that bit much power onto the field in the same sort of way in terms of a disincentive to move forward. Completely forget the withdrawal statement that I was starting to make. So what I'm going to do with the French is, because they're in a losing battle as far as I can tell, I'm not going to count units that withdraw them from the map in good order against their breaking point. You know, obviously they're not going to do much damage to the Brits if they pull them off. But now, if they take that as their goal, they're going to take a minor loss no matter what, just for ceding the terrain. But if they can get out of there without getting themselves up to that 115, it will only be a minor loss. And I think that's the best they can salvage out of this situation. We'll see. You know, if the dice turn totally against the Brits, and they really have to, because the Brits have some significant advantages. Numerically, they're a little bigger. Positionally, they're better. And they have better quality units. And as of right now, less of their army is demoralized. So their numerical superiority, you know, temporarily is like 2-1. And here's our current situation. The French used part of that light cav to charge the guns. That's always a dangerous situation. They get shot up coming in because of opportunity fire, and then the actual fire event, and finally the charge actually takes place at the end of the turn during the melee phase. And, well, they didn't get the guns out of there, and there aren't any cav left, so they got one of the guns, but at pretty hefty cost. I was kind of hoping the undefended guns up there would be really dangerous, but are really in danger. You can see they did cause some Portuguese to go into square. If they had broken through, these guys would have had to try to make a square check as well, which they probably would succeed. Getting knocked off the hill here a little bit. We did a charge, so the melee rules in this are that don't force you to advance into the hex that you take, into the space that you melee. This is a really clever move, and I think this is probably the single thing that gives this game an advantage over most that I've seen in terms of portraying the advantages to attack in a game. It's really not, you know, it's not an intuitive thing, the idea that I don't have to occupy the territory I just attacked. But the hexes are kind of big here, right? They may not represent the exact space taken. Well, they do not represent the exact space taken up by a unit. No game, no hex encounter game seems to do that very well. Minis do that, but the real advantage of doing this is it means your line doesn't necessarily get deformed. You can, you know, make an attack like this against this hex, knock the enemy out of it where you have an advantage, and then not have to actually advance. And given that close combat probably represents more than simply an actual melee charge, it probably, given most of these, the level at which these games are portrayed, it probably indicates a lot of close-range fire more than anything else. There is certainly a bayonet charge possible in there. But I don't see the need, you know, to have that sort of pushing forward of space. And by being able to keep your line together in a way that other designs don't tend to allow, it doesn't penalize the attacker quite as much for charging forward. In addition, the fact that you can kind of just pick two units and attack a single hex with them, etc., it really gives a lot of the advantages over to the attacker, and that's what we see. And I think that you know, where the attacker isn't, you know, penalized in the way that they often are in a game. And I think that represents the Napoleonic era better than really anything else that I've seen. And I think it's the fault of this one little rule, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but it's very cool that it works that way. Our point totals at the end of this: French at 59, Brits only at 23. The 59, there's like 11 disordered and routed units on the map, so that gets us up to 70. We're not quite ready to break yet, but you know, the writing is so clearly on the wall here with the flank collapsing here again. There's just nothing I can do about it except if I could fall back, but it's so hard to disengage. So we'll keep moving on. I got time for another turn at least on this one. The only thing that I kind of feel a little queasy about here is line formation is so good at firing, and casualties are important. You're going to get about the same casualties from good firepower as you will from a decent melee result. In fact, you may get more casualties from good firepower. You're more likely to disorder the enemy with a good melee result, though, which is even more important. But firepower is so effective that if you can kind of, get these 2-for-1 attacks and make them work from line formation, that may be a disincentive for going into that assault column formation. I don't mind that too much because honestly, the assault column was used heavily by the French and less so by everyone else. So it shouldn't be all that potent across the board. And then another factor here is if you really want to hit someone and break their whole line, a whole bunch of columns, hitting something like this might just break that whole line at once. Where if you go up in line, you're going to be picking off and sending one unit flying, and you're going to maintain your linear formation and not really be taking the territory as much. Not the territory in of itself matters, but driving the enemy back, getting those heavy disorders, and the capability to keep pushing forward. All seems to fit better with the assault column. The problem is really more my psychology than anything else. I'm very conservative and cautious when it comes to committing forces, so I'm a lot less except when it comes to charging the guns with my cap. It's situational, but I tend to do something half-assed like that instead of just, all right, fix bayonets and we're all going in, Something I didn't expect, which is that the English cav is actually better than the French cav. You flip these suckers over, well, this one's a 5, but this one's got a 6 for the regular cav hitting. The other was a light, and I was hitting light cav here, so that may be the factor in play. Plus, there was actually another +1. But anyway, I countercharged with the French cav, and that was a serious mistake. It put me down on the 1 to 2 minus table, and the French cav broke. But it did prevent the English from getting their charge off, which might have followed up into a disordered unit and caused even more problems. So I think it was a wise idea to countercharge. It just didn't quite get the results I expected. I expected the English cav to more or less bounce off the French cav, but to maybe disorder it so that I don't have to worry about it countercharging other units. Well, the French left flank continues to collapse. Center, big holes being gaped into it. This unit routed away. English able to restructure their army. It's a nice, tight little compact line going on here, though. Other than this little bulge here, it looks pretty nice. And that bulge is really only there because there were some French units up there at the beginning of this, which got shot up trying to withdraw. I do feel like the capability to disengage is a little harder in this than I'd expect it to be. Everything else is very pleasing. However, yeah, it feels more like 7 Years of War to me in terms of that aspect. What about the power of artillery to move up? I'm a little shakier in my own knowledge to be able to really judge how well the artillery is capable of acting as an offensive arm here. I haven't quite figured that out yet, so I'm not sure that there may be a weakness there that I'm not really seeing. In contrast, though, to the 7 Years' War, you do have that column formation, and attacks made in column aren't going to be hard to disengage from. So if you want to gain ground, that is actually the way to do it. Not just because you get to play on this cool melee table that's more likely to disorder people with more strength, but also that you give them a free pass to get out of there. That's not what I want, though. I'm here to destroy the enemy, not to capture territory. That's the scenario victory conditions. So far in all of them that I've seen, which seems a little strange, not absolutely so, but to some extent, how do you motivate the attack? So, for example, if this were not the starting situation of this game was fine because the English have a real incentive to attack. The French army spread out all over, which is why Wellington makes the attack. But if this were more of a Wellington decides to throw the dice, even though the French army is not as disorganized, he probably still has an advantage in troop quality. But then the question is, okay, well, who's on the strategic offensive? Because if you're not on the strategic offensive, if your desire is simply to shadow the enemy force and keep them from breaking, through or whatever, which kind of both sides had in some ways. They were just maneuvering around looking for the opportunity rather than with a, must defeat the enemy here type of situation. Well, if you're in a situation where one side's clearly on the offensive in the battle, it's hard to express that and to force them to take that offensive. Maybe you could do it by saying, well, if casualties don't reach a certain level, the other side wins, as opposed to giving them an actual terrain basis, which might be fairer. I kind of don't like, and you had that in the first scenario, I kind of don't like these battles where terrain becomes an important part of the victory conditions, unless there's, a strategic need for that terrain, like a key roadway that if it fell, the enemy would have to fall back significantly on their line of communication. So victory conditions are always an interesting thing to me, and I'm kind of intrigued by the fact that this doesn't seem to be using terrain-based victory conditions for much. I think that's a clever move, actually, although it's a little disconcerting. On the French side of the turn, kind of exciting things happen. You can see they actually got a pretty good series of die rolls, both from firepower and from some melees, where they plowed the center of the English line away. There's a problem, though. When I counted the numbers, 72 actually strength points have been wiped out. And when I added these up, I end up in a disorder level. That means I circled it to indicate this is the disorder level, and I'm going to have to make a roll for every unit to see if, for every good order unit to see if it disorders, and might have to fall back. So I might lose some of this positional advantage that I have here. And of course, that might draw withdrawal fire, which can cause an additional chance, which might rout the unit completely. And that effect as we go to 230 is indeed a little worse. Maybe a couple more casualties. I'm not at the 115 level, so I'm not too worried about that. But yeah, now it's a pretty thin little line up there at the front, trying to hold things, big gaps everywhere. I remember from last time, as I noted, I got the rules right this time. You got to check to make sure the unit's taken a step loss. So there were a couple of units that were ineligible to have to make a check, and of course all the disordered stuff just stays in the same state it's in. But this is not a good situation for the French at all. The English get to move now, and they're going to just basically wipe out this front line. There's, this gap here is no big deal. I can commit some of these guys. I don't have a reserve here, although I do have these guys which can slip in. But I have more than enough troops to brush this aside, and then I'm just dealing with a disorganized mass there. So up this one goes. I probably ought to just keep going and make one long video out of this, because I don't know that I don't think the battle is going to go 17 turns before I call it. But I'll put this one up, and maybe we'll have a short finish to it. Here we are at 230 Salamanque. The English line, noose tightening. got some French routed units behind the line. I think they're just basically dead because they've got to try to route this way. They're not going to be able to go through enemy territories, and they're just going, because I'm forcing units to actually route if they're routing, which isn't specified in the rules. Still a fair amount of English that are disordered. That hit through the center was painful, but there's not a lot of French left here, and you can see almost everything's in pretty crappy shape. Attempting to withdraw from skirmishers is fairly easy. I may try to get this guy out of here too and try to build a line somewhere, but honestly, we're just trying to get the army off at this point. We're already disordered. I forgot to take the extra -1 into account for that disorder on whatever morale checks the French made, which probably weren't very many. For the most part, the English aren't really engaging them. They're just pushing forward because the French have just collapsed. Side of the turn, basically nothing except opportunity fire as they pull away. And the one artillery the Brits had lined up is blocked line of sight by this tree. No, by the hill there. Maybe there's another gun somewhere that could do some long-range fire. I'm not even going to bother. The French position is pretty hopeless at this point. We get a couple of units that are going to get flank attacked from this side. The other option would be to get flank attacked from here, and unable to form a line. This guy rallied after this guy had already positioned himself. I figured he was going to run because the chances of him rallying weren't very good. We got a cav unit over here. That might do something. Basically, our points were at 94. Another 10 or so points of disordered units. A bunch of the routed units are gone now. They fled the map. The pile of destroyed French units is greater than the pile of ones that are still in existence. The Brits actually weren't even able to try a rally on this because he's out of command. But we got this Spanish unit limping forward, and the Spaniards aren't terribly useful here, but a few little auxiliaries, they help, I guess. That means turn 7, so all these turn 5 guys can start making rolls. And the French actually have some of their routed units are turn 5, so they got a chance too. I'm unable to form any kind of line. There's this inexorable advance by the Brits coming forward and, hitting units that are already disordered, routing them, hitting units that aren't disordered and smacking them around quite a bit. And there's just really nothing that can be done here. British rallies, not as good as you would have expected. There's a number of units that are running, but most of them, well, about half of my checks, and it's not that bad, I guess. These are 9 morale units. I think it get a little better than half, but they're partially recovering, and it's just, what I've got on the line for the Brits is enough to take the French out at this point, so who really cares? I think we're at the end. The French have pulled back a little bit. More units routing off, a thin attempt at a line. There's plenty of day left. I could continue playing this out. It is just a rout of the French army. I did far worse with the French than they historically did, which I find kind of amusing. Usually better on defensive operations, but this game is very, very friendly to the offensive. I'm not going to say too friendly simply because I don't really have a full grasp of what's going on with it yet. But yeah, the French are at 112 losses now, and obviously they have more than 3 disordered units, so boom, they're over the limit. This is as bad as it gets in terms of victory conditions for the game. I'm not always absolutely concerned with victory conditions, but I don't see anything else of interest here. The English are going to continue to be able to push forward with the line. The French are going to be unable to get out of there without it being a total rout. Feels too dramatic. I mean, if you look at the loss values, and again, maybe I'm doing something wrong, but this is a little worrisome. I'm going to tag this on the end of the last video and publish it all together instead of what I did. I was planning on doing it all in one, but there's just, 5 more minutes or whatever, so no reason for a whole video for that. I do like the system, what I see of it. I just, this felt a little bit too crushing a blow. And I'm not sure if it's something that I'm not doing correctly. One nice thing is I get to set something else up. I love doing series games like this because I can keep coming back to them without an additional rules investment. And then I can kind of break it up with other games. Maybe, generally I try to go with lighter games in between. When I'm doing something ridiculous like SPQR, I throw sometimes some bigger games in between and take a couple months off. All right, let's send this off.